I was selling my husband's piano when a stranger sat down and played a melody that should not exist outside of my memory. Thomas composed it himself. Not professionally, he was not a musician in any formal sense. He played the way some people cook, which is to say by instinct and with no interest in being taught. He had been playing versions of that melody since the first year of our marriage, adjusting it slightly over decades the way you adjust something you are still working out. He played it on Sunday mornings. He played it when he was thinking. He played it the evening before he died. I never described it to anyone. It was not something that translated into words. It was simply Thomas's melody, the way his handwriting was his handwriting, specific to him, unreproducible by anyone else. The young man who came to look at the piano was 28 years old. He sat down on the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. After 4 bars, I could not move. After 8, I understood that the life I thought I had finished excavating had one more room. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. He died 23 months ago on a Tuesday morning in February. In the time since, I have discovered more about his hidden life than I believed possible to discover. I had thought, by the time I listed the piano for sale, that I had found everything there was to find. A melody proved me wrong. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the piano, and the man who played it, and what I found when I asked him who taught him. The piano had been in the living room of every house we had ever owned. Thomas had brought it to our first apartment in the summer of 1986, 2 months before our wedding, transported in a rented van by himself and 2 law school friends who had complained about it for years afterward. It was an upright, dark walnut, not expensive, not particularly old, the kind of instrument that announces itself by occupying space rather than by producing exceptional sound. It had been his mother's, and before that her mother's, and it had come to Thomas when his mother moved to a smaller house and could no longer accommodate it. In 38 years of marriage, I never once suggested selling it. Not because it was beautiful, it was ordinary. Not because I played. I had given up piano lessons at 10 with no regret. But because Thomas played, and the piano was where Thomas went when he needed to think, and watching him sit at that bench was one of the most consistent images of our marriage. Sunday mornings especially. He would come downstairs before I was fully awake, and I would hear the piano from upstairs, and the sound of it meant the day was beginning properly, and everything was as it should be. The melody had been with us almost as long as the piano. He had not composed it in a single sitting. It had emerged gradually over the early years of our marriage, assembled from fragments I had heard him play and abandon and return to with slight variations. By the time Lucas was born, it had a recognizable shape. By the time Lucas started school, it was essentially fixed, though Thomas continued to make small adjustments at the edges, small refinements that I noticed the way you notice changes in a person you have lived alongside for years, not dramatically, but as a gradual accumulation of small differences. I asked him once what it was called. He said it didn't have a name. I asked what it was about. He said, "It's just something I work out on the piano when I need to work something out." I accepted that. It seemed true, and I had no reason to press further. The melody was Thomas's private process made audible. It was not a secret exactly. I heard it regularly. Lucas heard it growing up. Anyone who visited on a Sunday morning might have heard fragments of it drifting through the house. But it was private in the sense that it belonged entirely to Thomas, that it had no existence outside of his hands on the keys of that particular piano. After he died, the piano stood silent. I moved it to the new house, which required considerable effort and the same resentful complaining from the movers that Thomas's friends had produced in 1986. I had moved it because leaving it felt like abandonment, and I was not yet ready to abandon things. It stood in the corner of the living room for 22 months, and I passed it every day and occasionally put my hand on the top of it and thought about Sunday mornings. In November, I decided to sell it. Not impulsively. Not in grief. With the particular deliberate intention of a woman who has been building a new life from different materials and has understood, finally, that building requires making room. The piano was not mine. It had never been mine in any real sense. It was Thomas's, and keeping it was keeping a piece of Thomas that I no longer needed to hold on to in order to remember what was worth remembering. I posted it online on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I had 3 inquiries. I arranged viewings for the following Saturday. The second viewing was a young man named Daniel Reeves. He arrived at 11. He was 28 tall, with the particular careful courtesy of someone who had been raised to be polite in other people's homes. He asked about the piano's history in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than negotiating tactic. I told him it had belonged to my late husband and before that to his family for several generations. He nodded. He asked if he could play. I said of course. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and played the first 4 bars of Thomas's melody. My first thought was that I had misheard. That the notes were similar but not identical. That grief plays tricks with sound the way it plays tricks with faces and crowds, making the familiar appear where it has no business appearing. I stood in the doorway of the living room and told myself this was a coincidence and listened to the next 4 bars. They were not similar. They were the melody. Not approximately. Not in the way that 2 people independently arrive at the same chord progression, because certain progressions are common. The melody, the specific sequence of notes, the particular rhythm, the slight hesitation before the 3rd phrase that Thomas had always played and that I had heard hundreds of times, was coming from the hands of a 28-year-old man who had arrived at my door to look at a piano. I sat down. Not in a chair. The nearest solid surface was the wall, and I put my hand against it and stood because sitting would have required more intention than I had available. He played through the full melody. All of it. Including the ending that Thomas had settled on perhaps 15 years ago, a resolution that had taken him years to find, and that I had heard him play with the particular satisfaction of a man who has finally worked out what he was trying to work out. When he finished, he sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he turned to look at me. He said, "I'm sorry. I know that might have been strange to hear. My father taught me that piece when I was a child, and I always play it when I'm testing a piano. It's a habit. I should have asked first." I said, "Where did your father learn it?" He looked at me with the slight confusion of someone who has been asked a question they weren't expecting. He said, "He wrote it. It was his own piece. He played it all my life." I said, "What is your father's name?" The confusion in his face shifted into something more cautious. He said, "Why do you ask?" I said, "Because my husband wrote that melody. I have heard it played in this house for 30 years. He never taught it to anyone. He never wrote it down. And you just played it note for note." Daniel Reeves looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the piano. Then back at me. He said, "My father's name was Robert Harmon. He died 14 months ago." I said, "That is not a name I know." He nodded slowly, as though this answer was not entirely surprising to him, which was itself surprising. He said, "May I ask your husband's name?" I said, "Thomas Brooks." He was very still. He said, "I don't know that name." He said it without the particular quality of a person lying. He said it with the quality of a person who is assembling something in real time and is not certain what the assembled thing will look like. I said, "How long did your father play that melody?" He said, "As long as I can remember. He played it when I was a child whenever he sat at the piano. He taught it to me when I was perhaps 10 years old. He said it was something he had composed himself, that it was the only piece he had ever written." I said, "When did your father die?" He said, 14 months ago. Cardiac arrest. He had a heart condition he had managed privately for years. None of us knew how serious it was until it was too late. Cardiac arrest. Managed privately. I sat down properly then. I found a chair. Daniel Reeves remained on the piano bench, watching me with the carefully measured concern of a young man who understood that something significant was happening, but did not yet have enough information to understand what it was. I said, "Your father. Describe him." He said, "He was 64 when he died. Tall. Gray hair. He worked in finance for most of his career, consulting work. He traveled often. He was private about certain things. He and my mother separated when I was 12, and he was not consistently present after that, but he came back into my life when I was in my 20s, and those years, the last 7 or 8 before he died, those were good years. He was attentive. He paid attention. He paid attention. I looked at the piano. The melody had been in this house since 1986. Robert Harmon's melody, apparently, had been in Daniel Reeves's life since childhood. Two men who each claimed to have written the same piece of music. Two men who had each played it on pianos in their respective lives, privately, without writing it down, without teaching it to anyone except, in Robert Harmon's case, a son. Two men who died of cardiac arrest. I said, "Do you have a photograph of your father?" He pulled out his phone. He found a photograph. He handed it to me. The man in the photograph was not Thomas. He was similar in the general way of men of a certain age and type, tall, gray-haired, the bearing of someone who had moved through professional life with confidence. But he was not Thomas. Different face, different jaw, different eyes. I handed the phone back. I said, "That is not my husband." Daniel said, "No. I didn't think he would be." I said, "But they played the same melody." He said, "Yes." A silence. He said, "Mrs. Brooks, I need to tell you something. After my father died, I found some things in his house. Documents. I have been trying to understand them for 14 months. I came to look at this piano because I saw the listing and the address meant something to me from the documents. I didn't know who would open the door. I didn't know what I was going to say. I said, 'What address?' He said the address of my old house. The house on Birchwood Lane. The house I had sold 18 months ago. I said, 'How did your father have that address?' He said, 'I don't know. It was in a folder with other addresses. And with a name.' I said, 'What name?' He said, 'Thomas. Just Thomas. No last name.' Written in his father's handwriting on a piece of paper in a folder that Robert Harmon had kept locked in a cabinet in his home office for years. I called Patricia before Daniel Reeves had left my living room. I asked him to stay. I told him I needed 30 minutes to make some calls, and that I would explain everything I could explain, and that I would need him to share everything he had found in his father's documents. He said, "I came here hoping for something like that." He sat back down on the piano bench. After a moment, quietly, almost without seeming to intend to, he began to play the melody again. I stood in the kitchen doorway listening to it and thought about Thomas playing it on Sunday mornings. About the specific quality of the sound, the way it had been the background of 38 years of ordinary life. I had always assumed it was his alone. The possibility that had not occurred to me until this moment was that Thomas had learned it from someone else. That somewhere in the life he had kept hidden from me, someone had taught him a melody, and he had carried it home and played it for 38 years as though it had always been his. That the melody I had always understood as the most private expression of the man I married was, in fact, someone else's. Patricia arrived within the hour. She had learned, over 23 months, to ask few questions on the phone when I called and said I needed her immediately. She arrived, sat across from Daniel Reeves, and listened to everything he had told me with the focused attention of a woman who is building a picture from new pieces and assessing in real time how they connect to the picture she already has. Daniel had brought the folder with him. He had not brought it to show anyone. He had carried it with him for 14 months the way people carry things they cannot resolve, not in hope of immediate resolution, but because leaving it at home felt like abandonment, and the problem did not become smaller for being ignored. Inside the folder were 4 items. The first was the piece of paper with the Birchwood Lane address, and the name Thomas written in Robert Harmon's handwriting. The second was a photograph, not of Thomas, but of a building. A law firm. The firm where Thomas had practiced for 20 years before transitioning to a smaller practice 5 years before his death. The photograph was printed from the internet, the kind of image that appears on a professional firm's website. On the back, in the same handwriting, the name of the firm and a date from 9 years ago. The third was a letter. Handwritten, 3 pages, in a different hand than Robert Harmon's. Patricia read it first, which she did with the professional discipline of someone who needed to assess its legal significance before I absorbed its emotional content. She set it down and looked at me. She said, "I need you to read this carefully." The letter was from Thomas. Not addressed to Robert Harmon. Not addressed to anyone by name. It began, "If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong that I was not able to prevent. What follows is an explanation I should have given years ago. Thomas had written the letter 9 years ago. The date in the top corner was the same year as the photograph of his firm. He explained, in 3 pages of careful legal prose that was also unmistakably personal, the nature of his connection to Robert Harmon. Robert Harmon had been a client. Not in the formal professional sense, Robert Harmon had never retained Thomas's firm officially. But 20 years earlier, in the period when Thomas's planning had been in its early architecture, Robert Harmon had approached Thomas through a mutual contact. He had needed legal advice about a financial arrangement that existed outside the boundaries of the advice Thomas was supposed to give. Thomas had given it. Not officially. Not on the record. In exchange for what Thomas later described in the letter as a debt that could not be repaid in money, Robert Harmon had given Thomas something. He had given him the melody. Not as a transaction. Not as payment. As a gesture of the kind that exists between people who have done something outside the rules together and understand that what binds them is not legal but human. Robert Harmon had been, before his financial career, a musician. Not professionally, he had abandoned music for business in his 20s and had not looked back. But the melody had survived. It was the only piece he had ever composed, and he carried it through the decades of his other life the way Thomas had carried it through his. He had taught it to Thomas one evening over drinks after a meeting that should not have taken place. Thomas had taken it home and played it for 38 years and told no one where it came from. The letter then turned. Thomas wrote, "What Robert gave me was not only the melody. He gave me the template." Watching him manage 2 separate lives with the calm of a man who had accepted that people contain more than one version of themselves, I understood for the first time that what I had been considering as impossible was simply uncharted. He had done it. I could do it differently. Better. With more care for the people involved. I read that sentence 3 times. Thomas had watched Robert Harmon maintain 2 lives. Had taken this as a template. Had believed he could do it better. Robert Harmon had not only given Thomas a melody. He had given him the idea. Daniel Reeves was reading his phone with careful neutrality while Patricia and I absorbed this. He had not read the letter. He had handed the folder to us intact, unopened, saying he had looked at the other items but had understood the letter was not his to read. I asked him, "Did your father have another family?" He looked up. He said, "I've been trying to answer that question for 14 months. He said, "I think yes. I think there was another family. I have not been able to find them and I haven't been sure whether I should try." I thought about the 4th item in the folder, which Patricia had not yet opened. Patricia opened it. It was a list of names and addresses, written in Robert Harmon's hand. 12 entries. Dates beside each one. Women's names, all of them, spanning 25 years. Daniel Reeves looked at the list. He said, "I found that the week after he died. I didn't know what it was. I still don't know what all of it means." I looked at the list. 12 names. 12 women whose lives Robert Harmon had moved through over 25 years. Thomas had seen this man as a template. Thomas had believed he could do it better. In the end, Thomas had managed 5 women and multiple identities over the course of their marriage. Robert Harmon had managed 12. I set the list down. I looked at the piano across the room. Thomas had brought the melody home from a man who had done what Thomas wanted to do. Had played it every Sunday morning for 38 years. Had given it to me, unknowingly, as the most intimate sound of our marriage. The most intimate sound of our marriage had belonged to someone else first. Agent Torres received the folder the following Monday. She reviewed it over 2 days and called Patricia with her assessment on Wednesday morning. The letter from Thomas, the address list, the photograph of the firm, none of it produced new criminal liability. Thomas was dead. Robert Harmon was dead. The early financial arrangement between them, whatever its exact nature, was beyond any statute of limitations. What the documents produced was context. The kind of context that does not change consequences, but does change understanding. Agent Torres said, "It appears Thomas learned from someone who had done this before him. Someone who had managed multiple lives over a longer period and with more subjects than Thomas ultimately managed." If Robert Harmon had lived longer, or if his health had not intervened, it is possible his situation would have eventually been what Thomas's became. She said, "The difference is that Thomas had someone to learn from." I thought about that for a long time. About Thomas as a student. About the particular meeting 20 years earlier where he had watched Robert Harmon and understood something about what was possible. About a melody exchanged between two men who were building the same kind of hidden life at different stages of its construction. The list of 12 women. Patricia ran the names through the resources available to her. Several were findable. 3 had died. 2 had moved addresses multiple times in ways that suggested disruption rather than choice. 4 were located and, after careful initial contact through Patricia's office, agreed to a brief conversation. What emerged from those conversations was consistent. Robert Harmon had operated in the same way Thomas had operated, with the same fundamental architecture, a primary life, multiple parallel relationships, a talent for compartmentalization, and the specific kind of charm that makes people feel completely seen. Several of the women had known something was not right and had stayed anyway. Several had not known anything until something small had cracked the surface. None of them knew about the others. None of them knew about Thomas. None of them knew that the man they had loved had given his melody to a lawyer one evening over drinks, and that the lawyer had taken it home and played it for 38 years on a dark walnut piano that was now listed for sale in Connecticut. I did not reach out to all 12. Some names on the list were simply that, names, without context, without enough information to justify contact. Some situations, Patricia advised, were better left to find their own resolution. The women who had spoken with us had received what they needed. The others would come to what they needed through their own paths. Daniel Reeves came back to the house 3 weeks after the first visit. Not to buy the piano. I had taken it off the market. I had not made a permanent decision about it. I simply understood, after everything, that selling it immediately was not the right thing. The piano needed to stay until I had decided what I wanted to do with what it now represented. He came because I had invited him. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told him everything I could tell him about what we had found and what it meant. I told him about Thomas, the full version, the 23 months of discovery, the women and the identities, and the plan that had ended when Lindsay intervened before it could be executed. He listened with the particular quality of attention of a young man who has been carrying his own version of this story for 14 months and is now hearing the parallel version for the first time. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My father was a good man in certain ways. He was present when he was present. He paid attention in the way your husband paid attention. He made you feel, when he was there, that there was nowhere else he would rather be." I said, "Yes. Thomas was that way too." He said, "I used to think the problem was that he couldn't fully commit. That he was emotionally incapable of choosing one life. My therapist called it a fear of intimacy. A fear of being fully known." He paused. He said, "Now I think it was something simpler and more deliberate. I think they both knew exactly what they were doing and chose it. Not out of incapacity. Out of preference. Out of the belief that they could have everything and that having everything was worth whatever it cost the people around them." I looked at him. He was 28 years old, and he had arrived at a conclusion that had taken me 23 months to approach, and that he had stated more plainly than I had managed to state it to myself. I said, "Yes. I think that's right." He looked at the piano in the living room through the doorway. He said, "The melody. My father didn't give it to yours. He taught it to him. There's a difference." I said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Giving is a transfer. Teaching is a relationship." My father sat with Thomas and played that melody and watched him learn it note by note. That takes time. That takes a kind of presence. Whatever they were to each other in those meetings, whatever they built between them that was worth a melody, it was real enough to be worth teaching carefully. I thought about that. I thought about Thomas sitting with a man I had never known, in a room I had never seen, learning a melody note by note. Carrying it home. Playing it for 38 years on a Sunday morning while I came downstairs, and the day began properly and everything seemed as it should be. The melody had been real even if its origins had not been what I believed. The Sunday mornings had been real. The feeling of everything being as it should be had been real in the only way a feeling can be real. It had been genuinely experienced by the person having it. That is the hardest thing to hold. The realness of experiences that were built on foundations that were not what they appeared to be. Daniel Reeves left after 2 hours. At the door, he paused and turned back. He said, "I'm glad the piano is staying. I don't think it should be sold right now." I said, "Neither do I." He said, "Do you play?" I said, "No. I gave up lessons at 10. He said, "I could teach you the melody, if you wanted to learn it." I looked at him. A 28-year-old man who had come to buy a piano and had instead found himself in the middle of a story he had been carrying one side of for 14 months. Offering to teach me the melody his father had taught his father, which my husband had played every Sunday morning for 38 years. I said, "Let me think about that." He nodded. He left. I stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the piano. I am still thinking about it. It is January. 23 months since Thomas died. 6 weeks since Daniel Reeves sat at the piano bench in my living room and played a melody I have heard 1,000 times in a voice I had never heard before. The piano is still here. I have not made a decision about it. I have stopped requiring myself to make decisions before I am ready to make them. That is one of the things 23 months has taught me, the difference between the decisions that need to be made immediately and the ones that can wait for the right understanding to arrive. Lucas came for New Year with the grandchildren. The younger one found the piano immediately, the way children find things they are not supposed to touch, and pressed several keys with both hands in the manner of someone who has discovered that pressing things produces sound and intends to press all of them. I stood in the doorway and watched and did not say stop. Sophie called from Portland on New Year's Day. She had spoken with her mother on Christmas. She said Vivian sent her love, which Vivian has not previously done through Sophie, and which Sophie reported with the particular careful neutrality of someone who is monitoring how I receive it. I said, "Please tell her the same." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know this family you've built? The one that doesn't have a name. It keeps getting bigger." I said, "Yes, it does." She said, "Is that all right with you?" I thought about it. I said, "Yes, I think it is." The melody. I have thought about it more than almost anything else in 6 weeks. About what it means that Thomas carried something home from a meeting that should not have taken place and played it every Sunday morning for 38 years as though it had always been his. I have arrived at something that is not quite a conclusion, but is close enough to be useful. The melody was not Thomas's in origin, but it became his through the playing of it. Through 38 years of Sunday mornings. Through the way he adjusted it gradually, the small refinements over decades, the ending he worked out over years and finally found. A thing that begins as someone else's can become yours through the sustained attention you bring to it. That is true of the melody. It is also true of the marriage. Thomas did not build his hidden life from nothing. He learned its architecture from someone else. He took a template and applied it with his own particular care and thoroughness. The life he built with me, the 38 years of Sunday mornings and dinners and seasons and the bedroom window cracked open in January, was real even if the man living it was also living something else. What I cannot determine, and have stopped trying to determine, is what he would have become without Robert Harmon's template. Maybe the same. Some people find their own way to the same destination regardless of what maps they encounter. Maybe different. Maybe the meeting that never should have taken place was the moment that made everything that followed possible. I will not know. And that is all right. If you are watching this and there is something in your life that you believed was entirely your own, something intimate and private that you thought came only from the person who gave it to you, and you have discovered that its origins were elsewhere, I want to say this. The experience of it was yours. The Sunday mornings were mine. The sound of the melody from upstairs while the day began. The feeling of everything being as it should be. Those were mine regardless of where the melody came from. No subsequent discovery changes the reality of what was experienced. That is the thing grief teaches eventually if you stay with it long enough. The real things remain real, even when their origins turn out to be more complicated than you knew. I am 62 years old. A young man came to buy my piano and played a melody I had heard 10,000 times. He taught me something I had not known I needed to learn. The piano is still here. I am still deciding. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever discovered that something you thought was entirely someone's own had been carried to them from somewhere else. Tell me what you did with that. I read every single one.